The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie as Sarah Mitchell knelt beside the smoldering remains of what had been her family's covered wagon just hours before. The acrid smell of burned canvas and charred wood filled her nostrils, mixing with the dust that seemed to coat everything in this endless stretch of Kansas territory. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the ashes, searching desperately for anything that might have survived the flames. The attack had come without warning in the dead of night. Sarah had been sleeping peacefully beside her husband Thomas and their 8-year-old daughter Emma when the thunder of hoofbeats jolted her awake. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, masked riders had surrounded their small camp, whooping and firing shots into the air. The terror in Emma's eyes as she clutched her worn rag doll would haunt Sarah forever. Thomas had grabbed his rifle, shouting for Sarah and Emma to run toward the creek. But there had been nowhere to hide on the open prairie. The outlaws had herded them back like cattle, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas, their eyes cold and merciless in the flickering light of the torches they carried. "Please," Thomas had begged, his voice cracking with desperation, "take whatever you want, but don't hurt my family." The leader of the gang, a tall man with cruel eyes visible above his mask, had "We'll take what we want anyway, mister. Question is whether you're smart enough to stay out of our way." Sarah remembered the sickening sound of the rifle butt connecting with Thomas's skull. He had crumpled to the ground like a broken puppet, blood seeping from a gash above his left temple. Emma's scream had pierced the night air, a sound so filled with terror that it seemed to echo still across the empty prairie. The outlaws had worked quickly and efficiently, like vultures picking clean a carcass. They took everything of value: the small wooden chest containing their life savings of $63, the silver locket that had belonged to Sarah's mother, Thomas's grandfather's pocket watch, and even Emma's few precious toys. They slaughtered the 2 oxen that had faithfully pulled their wagon across hundreds of miles, taking only the choicest cuts of meat and leaving the rest to rot under the burning sun. But the cruelest blow had come when they set fire to the wagon itself. Sarah had watched in horror as flames consumed not just their shelter and remaining possessions, but also the carefully kept journals documenting their journey west. The family Bible with 3 generations of births and deaths recorded in its margins, and the small collection of books that Emma was learning to read. "Please," Sarah had sobbed, still cradling her unconscious husband's head in her lap. "Those are all we have left of our old life." The gang leader had spat in the dirt near her feet. "Old life's gone, lady. Best you learn that quick." They had ridden away as suddenly as they had appeared, their laughter echoing across the prairie like the cries of demons. Sarah had spent the rest of the night trying to wake Thomas, dabbing at his wound with water from their nearly empty canteen and praying to God that he would open his eyes. But as dawn broke over the Kansas plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that should have been beautiful, Thomas Mitchell drew his last breath. Emma had not spoken a single word since watching her father die. She sat now a few yards away from the burned wagon, staring blankly at the horizon, with her small arms wrapped around her knees. The child's silence was perhaps more terrifying to Sarah than her earlier screams had been. It was as if the shock had stolen not just Emma's voice, but a piece of her soul. Sarah had spent the morning digging a grave with her bare hands, the prairie soil proving harder than she had expected. Her fingernails were broken and bloody, her palms raw with blisters, but she had persevered. Thomas deserved a proper burial, even if she had no proper words to say over him. She had wrapped his body in their last remaining blanket, one that had somehow escaped the flames, and lowered him into the shallow grave as gently as she could manage. Standing over the small mound of earth, Sarah had tried to summon some appropriate prayer or psalm, but her mind felt as empty as the vast sky above. Instead, she had simply whispered, "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Now, hours later, she continued her futile search through the ashes. Her practical blue dress, the one Thomas had always said brought out the color of her eyes, was torn and stained beyond repair. Her brown hair had come loose from its careful bun and hung in tangles around her dirt-streaked face. She looked nothing like the hopeful young woman who had set out from Missouri 6 weeks ago with dreams of starting a new life in California. The irony was not lost on her that they had been so close to their destination. Fort Larned was only 2 days' journey to the west, and from there it would have been a relatively safe passage to California. They had survived river crossings that had claimed other wagons, weathered storms that had scattered their traveling party, and endured the constant threat of Indian attacks that never materialized, only to be destroyed by common outlaws when safety seemed within reach. Sarah found a small metal button that had fallen from Thomas's best shirt, and she clutched it to her chest like a talisman. It was pitifully little to show for 26 years of marriage and a lifetime of dreams. She thought of their small farm back in Missouri, sold to finance this journey west. There would be no going back now, even if she had the means to travel. The new owners had probably already plowed under her carefully tended garden and whitewashed over the pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe that had recorded Emma's growth through the years. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to shimmer off the prairie in wavering columns that made the distant hills look like mirages. Sarah's lips were cracked from thirst, and she knew they had perhaps a day's worth of water left in the single canteen that had somehow survived the destruction. After that, she and Emma would face the terrible choice between dying of thirst where they sat, or attempting to walk across the trackless prairie in search of help. Emma finally stirred, turning her large blue eyes toward her mother with an expression that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "are we going to die here?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She wanted to gather her daughter in her arms and promise that everything would be all right, that help would come, that they would find a way to survive this nightmare. But the words stuck in her throat. She had always prided herself on being honest with Emma, on treating the child with the respect due to someone who had already endured hardships that would test many adults. "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah admitted, her voice barely steady, "but I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure we don't." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she had expected nothing less than brutal honesty. "Papa would want us to be brave." "Yes," Sarah agreed, tears threatening to spill over again. "He would." The child stood up slowly, brushing prairie dust from her faded calico dress. "Should we start walking toward the fort?" Sarah considered this. Fort Larned was still 2 days away by wagon, which meant it would take them at least 4 or 5 days on foot, assuming they didn't lose their way on the unmarked prairie. They had no food except for a small portion of hardtack that had been in Sarah's apron pocket during the attack, and water for perhaps 1 day if they were careful. The likelihood of them reaching the fort alive was slim at best, but staying here meant certain death. Already, she could see buzzards circling high overhead, drawn by the scent of the slaughtered oxen. Soon they would descend, and Sarah shuddered to think of Emma witnessing that particular horror. "We'll wait until evening," Sarah decided. "Travel at night when it's cooler. We can follow the stars." Emma nodded again, displaying a composure that broke Sarah's heart. No child should have to be this strong, this accepting of circumstances beyond their control. But life on the frontier had taught them all that survival sometimes demanded the impossible. As the day wore on, Sarah continued her search through the debris, driven more by a need to stay busy than by any real hope of finding anything useful. She discovered the twisted remains of her sewing basket, the metal scissors warped beyond recognition by the heat. A few pages from Emma's primer had somehow survived, though they were singed around the edges and barely legible. The heat became oppressive as the sun reached its zenith. Sarah fashioned a small shelter from the remains of the wagon's canvas cover, creating a patch of shade where she and Emma could rest during the worst of the afternoon heat. They shared small sips of water and nibbled at the hardtack, trying to make their meager supplies last as long as possible. As evening approached, Sarah began to prepare for their desperate journey. She tore strips from her petticoat to wrap around their feet, which would have to serve as protection since their shoes were designed for riding in a wagon, not walking across rough prairie for days on end. She fashioned a small bundle from what remained of their possessions, the precious canteen, the hardtack, Thomas's button, and the singed pages from Emma's primer. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber when Emma suddenly grabbed her mother's arm. "Mama," she whispered urgently, "someone's coming." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. Her first thought was that the outlaws had returned, perhaps having forgotten something in their haste to escape. She grabbed Emma's hand and looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the prairie offered no concealment. They were as exposed as insects on a tabletop. Then she saw him, a lone rider approaching from the east, silhouetted against the setting sun. He sat tall in his saddle, and even from a distance she could see that he rode with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life on horseback. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. A weathered hat pulled low over his features, a long brown coat that reached nearly to his stirrups, and what appeared to be a rifle resting across his saddle. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. He could be another outlaw, or perhaps a scout for the gang that had destroyed their lives. But something about his approach suggested otherwise. He rode openly, making no attempt at stealth, and his pace was steady but not urgent. If he meant harm, surely he would be more cautious in his approach. Still, she positioned herself protectively in front of Emma and waited for the stranger to reach them. As he drew nearer, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 30 years old. His face was deeply tanned from long exposure to sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who spent his days squinting across great distances. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. Not pity exactly, but a kind of grim understanding that suggested he had seen scenes like this before. He reined in his horse about 20 feet away and touched the brim of his hat politely. "Ma'am," he said simply, his voice carrying the soft drawl of someone from the southern states, "I'm mighty sorry for your troubles." Sarah found herself unable to speak for a moment. After hours of believing that she and Emma would die alone on this God-forsaken prairie, the simple presence of another human being seemed almost miraculous. But years of frontier life had taught her caution, and she kept her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you for your concern, sir. We're managing as best we can." The stranger studied the scene before him with eyes that missed nothing. The burned wagon, the small grave marked with a crude wooden cross, the pitifully small bundle of possessions, and most tellingly, the look of desperate exhaustion in Sarah's face. He had clearly seen enough to piece together most of their story. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. "I've been tracking the gang that did this for the better part of 3 weeks now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You know who they were?" "The Dalton brothers and their crew," Jake replied grimly. "They've been hitting wagon trains and isolated homesteads all across this territory. You're not their first victims, ma'am, and I'm afraid you won't be their last unless someone stops them." Emma stepped out from behind her mother, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "Are you a lawman, mister?" Jake's expression softened slightly as he looked down at the child. "Not exactly, little miss, but sometimes a man has to take it upon himself to see that justice gets done." Sarah felt a flutter of hope in her chest, though she tried to suppress it. "Are you saying you might be able to recover our possessions?" "I'm saying I intend to try," Jake replied. "But first we need to get you and your daughter somewhere safe. You can't stay out here." The simple statement hit Sarah with unexpected force. For hours, she had been steeling herself for what seemed like an impossible journey, preparing to lead Emma across the trackless prairie with almost no supplies and little chance of survival. The idea that someone else might take responsibility, might offer help without expecting anything in return, was almost too much to comprehend. "We were planning to walk to Fort Larned," she managed to say. Jake shook his head. "That's 4 days on foot across open country, ma'am. Even if you had adequate supplies, which you don't, the chances of making it safely are slim. There are other dangers out here besides the Dalton gang." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that accepting help from a stranger carried its own risks. She had heard too many stories of women alone on the frontier who had traded one danger for another. As if reading her thoughts, Jake said quietly, "Ma'am, I give you my word as a gentleman that you and your daughter will be treated with complete respect. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly, but I am asking you to let me help you survive this." There was something in his voice, a quality of absolute sincerity, that made Sarah's decision for her. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was the simple recognition that Emma deserved a chance at life, even if it meant taking a risk. "What do you propose, Mr. Steinman?" "Morrison? There's a trading post about half a day's ride south of here, run by a man named Samuel Fletcher and his wife. Good people who've helped other folks in situations like yours. You and your daughter can stay there safely while I track down the Daltons and try to recover what was stolen from you." Emma looked up at her mother with eyes that held a spark of hope for the first time since the attack. "Can we trust him, Mama?" Sarah studied Jake Morrison's face in the fading light. She saw strength there, and determination, but also something else, a kind of weary sadness that suggested he too had lost something precious to violent men. Perhaps that was what gave her the courage to nod. "We'll go with you, Mr. Knight. Morrison. And thank you." Jake touched his hat brim again. "No need for thanks, ma'am. Just gather what you need. We'll be traveling through the night to reach Fletcher's place by morning." As Sarah collected their few remaining possessions, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Hope. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. Jake Morrison had appeared when all seemed lost, offering not just rescue but the possibility of justice. She didn't know if he would be able to recover their stolen belongings or bring the outlaws to account, but his simple presence had transformed their situation from hopeless to merely desperate. And sometimes, Sarah reflected as she helped Emma onto Jake's horse, desperate was enough to work with. The ride to Fletcher's trading post took them through the long prairie night under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. Emma rode in front of Jake on his sturdy bay mare, her small body relaxed in exhausted sleep despite the horse's steady gait. Sarah walked alongside, grateful for Jake's slow pace that allowed her to keep up despite her weariness. Jake Morrison proved to be a man of few words during their journey. but Sarah found his quiet presence reassuring rather than unsettling. When she stumbled over a prairie dog hole in the darkness, he was off his horse instantly to steady her. When Emma began to shiver in the cool night air, he wordlessly draped his long coat around her shoulders without being asked. "Tell me about the Dalton brothers," Sarah said during one of their brief rest stops, more to break the silence than from any real desire to know details about the men who had destroyed her life. Jake was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "Charlie Dalton's the leader, smart, ruthless, and mean as a rattlesnake. His brother Pete's the muscle, not much between the ears but dangerous as a loaded gun. They've got maybe 6 or 7 other men riding with them, changing faces as some get killed or jailed and others join up. How long have you been after them?" Another long pause. 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. The precision of his answer suggested this hunt was deeply personal, but Sarah didn't press for details. Every person on the frontier carried their own sorrows, and she had learned that pushing for explanations usually brought more pain than understanding. As dawn approached, the trading post appeared on the horizon like a small island of civilization in the sea of grass. It was larger than Sarah had expected, a substantial log building with a wide front porch and several smaller outbuildings scattered around it. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting the Fletchers were already up and about their morning chores. Samuel Fletcher emerged from the main building as they approached, a tall, bearded man in his 50s, with the solid build of someone accustomed to physical labor. His wife Margaret followed close behind, wiping her hands on her apron, and already reaching out toward Emma with the instinctive gesture of a woman who had raised children of her own. "Jake Morrison," Samuel called out in greeting. "Been wondering when you'd turn up again. And who might these ladies be?" Jake dismounted and helped Emma down from the saddle, the child still drowsy from her night's sleep. "Samuel, Margaret, meet Sarah Mitchell and her daughter Emma. They had a run-in with the Daltons 2 nights ago." The simple statement conveyed everything that needed to be said. Margaret Fletcher's face immediately softened with sympathy, and she hurried forward to take Emma's small hand in both of hers. "Oh, you poor dear things," she murmured, her voice carrying the warmth of maternal concern. "Come inside right away. You must be exhausted and half-starved. Samuel, help Mr. Morrison with his horse while I get these ladies settled." The interior of the trading post was a welcome sight after their night of uncertainty. The main room was large and comfortable, with rough-hewn furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from coffee and flour to ammunition and farming tools. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Margaret quickly stirred up the coals to chase away the morning chill. "Now then," Margaret said, bustling about with efficient kindness, "let's get some hot food into you both. And Emma, sweetheart, would you like to wash up while I'm fixing breakfast?" For the first time since the attack, Emma smiled, a tiny expression that nevertheless seemed like a miracle to Sarah. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." While Margaret fussed over Emma, Sarah found herself seated at the rough wooden table with a cup of coffee that tasted better than any she could remember. The warmth of the trading post, the kindness of strangers, and the simple luxury of sitting down without having to watch the horizon for danger combined to make her feel almost human again. Jake and Samuel entered, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Samuel was shaking his head with the expression of a man who had heard too many similar stories. "The Daltons hit the Patterson family just last week," Samuel reported grimly. "Burned them out completely. Took everything they had. Patterson himself is laid up with a busted arm, and his wife's expecting their 3rd child any day now." Jake's jaw tightened. "How many families is that now, Samuel?" 7 that I know of personally. Probably twice that many we haven't heard about. They're getting bolder, hitting closer to the settlements. Sheriff Hawkins in Dodge City has paper out on them, but he's got no men to spare for hunting them down. Sarah listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Jake Morrison wasn't just some drifter who happened to come along at the right moment. He was actively hunting the gang that had destroyed not just her family, but many others. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "may I ask why you've taken this upon yourself? You mentioned you're not a lawman." Jake looked uncomfortable with the question, but after a moment he answered, "The Daltons killed my brother and his wife 6 months ago, burned out their homestead near Wichita and left their 2 young children orphaned." The simple words carried a world of pain. Sarah nodded, understanding now the source of the quiet determination she had sensed in him. They were both victims of the same predators, both left to pick up the pieces of shattered lives. Margaret appeared with plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that made Emma's eyes widen with delight. The child fell upon the food with the desperate hunger of someone who had been subsisting on hardtack for days. Sarah tried to eat more slowly but found herself nearly as ravenous as her daughter. "You'll both stay here as long as you need," Margaret announced with the firmness of someone not to be argued with. "We've got plenty of room, and frankly, the company will be welcome." "Gets lonely out here with just Samuel and me. We can't possibly impose," Sarah began, but Samuel waved her objections aside. "Nonsense. We've helped other folks get back on their feet after the Daltons hit them. Consider it our contribution to making this territory safe for decent people." Jake finished his breakfast and stood, adjusting his gun belt with practiced efficiency. "I should be moving on. The trail's already 2 days old." Sarah felt a flutter of panic. In the space of one night, this quiet stranger had become their lifeline to safety and justice. The thought of him riding away into danger on their behalf was both humbling and terrifying. "How will we know if you find them?" she asked. "I'll be back," Jake said simply. "Might take a few weeks, but I'll be back. And with luck, I'll have your belongings with me." Emma looked up from her plate, her young face serious. "Will you kill them, Mr. Tang? Morrison?" The blunt question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Jake studied the child's face for a long moment before answering. "I'll do whatever justice requires, little miss. Sometimes that means bringing men in alive to face a judge and jury. Sometimes it doesn't." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. The frontier was a harsh place where formal law was often hundreds of miles away. Men like Jake Morrison served as judge, jury, and sometimes executioner because there was no one else to do the job. "Be careful," was all she said. Jake touched his hat brim in that now familiar gesture. "Always am, ma'am." After he rode away, Sarah spent the morning helping Margaret with various household tasks, grateful to have something to occupy her hands and mind. Emma quickly made friends with the trading post's collection of barn cats, and seemed to be slowly returning to something approaching normal childhood behavior. In the afternoon, while Emma napped and Margaret worked on mending some torn clothing, Samuel drew Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Mrs. Chiscaste." "Mitchell," he said gently, "I hope you won't take offense, but Margaret and I have been talking, and we'd like to make you a proposition." Sarah waited, unsure what to expect. "We've been thinking about hiring someone to help with the trading post. Business has been picking up lately, and Margaret's not as young as she used to be. The work's not hard, mostly keeping track of inventory, helping customers, and lending a hand with cooking and cleaning. We could provide room and board for you and Emma, plus a small salary. Nothing fancy, but enough to help you get back on your feet." The offer was so unexpected and generous that Sarah found herself speechless for a moment. "Mr. Fletcher, that's incredibly kind, but I couldn't possibly—" "Before you say no," Samuel interrupted, "think about Emma. She needs stability, a chance to heal from what she's been through. And frankly, we need the help. It would be a fair trade, nothing like charity." Sarah looked around the trading post, trying to imagine making a life here. It wasn't the California dream she and Thomas had shared, but it was safety and honest work and a chance for Emma to grow up among decent people. Perhaps more importantly, it was a way to start over without the constant reminder of everything they had lost. "Could I have some time to think about it?" she asked. "All the time you need," Samuel assured her. "The offer will stand regardless." That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into the comfortable bed Margaret had prepared for them, her daughter asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Mama, are we going to stay here?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart. How would you feel about that?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her small face serious in the lamplight. "I miss Papa something terrible, and I miss our wagon and all our things. But Mrs. Fletcher makes good biscuits, and Mr. Betta. Fletcher showed me how the cats catch mice in the barn. And maybe if we stayed, Mr. Morrison would visit sometimes and tell us about his adventures." The child's simple acceptance of their changed circumstances both broke Sarah's heart and filled her with admiration. Emma had already grasped what Sarah was still struggling to understand, that their old life was truly gone, and the only choice was to build something new from whatever pieces remained. Over the following days, Sarah found herself falling into the rhythm of life at Fletcher's trading post. She discovered she had a knack for dealing with customers and keeping track of inventory. Margaret taught her how to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter months, skills that would serve her well regardless of where she ultimately settled. Emma blossomed under the combined attention of the Fletchers and the freedom to explore the trading post and its surroundings. She helped Margaret with simple kitchen tasks, learned to milk the cow from Samuel, and spent hours reading to the barn cats from the few books in the Fletchers' small library. 2 weeks after Jake Morrison had ridden away, a traveling preacher stopped at the trading post. Reverend William Hayes was an elderly man who made regular circuits through the scattered settlements of western Kansas, bringing the comfort of religion to people who might not see a minister for months at a time. That Sunday morning, the trading post's main room was converted into a makeshift church. Samuel and Margaret, Sarah and Emma, and 3 other families who lived within riding distance gathered for the first formal religious service Sarah had attended since leaving Missouri. Reverend Hayes was a gifted speaker who understood the particular hardships faced by frontier families. His sermon focused on the story of Job, the righteous man who lost everything but found the strength to rebuild his life through faith and perseverance. "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," the Reverend intoned, his voice carrying easily through the large room. "But he also provides new mercies each morning, new opportunities to serve him and our fellow man. Sometimes what seems like ending is really beginning in disguise." After the service, Reverend Hayes sought out Sarah for a private word. "Mrs. Fletcher told me something of your circumstances, my dear. I want you to know that what happened to your family was not God's will, but the work of evil men acting against his purposes." Sarah had been wrestling with questions of faith ever since Thomas's death. How could a loving God allow such terrible things to happen to innocent people? Why had they been singled out for such suffering? "I've been having trouble understanding why this happened to us, Reverend," she admitted. "We were good people, faithful people. We never harmed anyone." "Faith isn't about understanding why bad things happen," Reverend Hayes replied gently. "It's about finding the strength to continue in spite of them. Your husband's death was a tragedy, but your survival and your daughter's might be the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes God uses our greatest sorrows to lead us to our greatest purposes." That night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to Emma's peaceful breathing beside her, she found herself thinking about the Reverend's words. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps there was some purpose to their suffering that she couldn't yet see. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Morrison's departure when Samuel came in from the morning chores with an expression of concern on his weathered face. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there's a rider coming from the east. Might be nothing, but I want you and Emma to stay inside until we know who it is." Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. Her first thought was that the Dalton gang had somehow tracked them to the trading post. But as the rider drew closer, Samuel relaxed visibly. "It's all right," he called out. "I recognize him. It's Deputy Marshal Collins from Dodge City." Deputy Collins proved to be a young man with a serious demeanor and the dusty look of someone who had been riding hard for days. He accepted Margaret's offer of coffee and food before delivering his news. "I'm looking for a Mrs. M. Schenko." Sarah Mitchell," he said, his eyes scanning the faces around the table. "I've got word about Jake Morrison and the Dalton gang." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. What's happened?" The deputy's expression was grave. "Morrison caught up with the Daltons 3 days ago near the Colorado border. There was a fight. When the shooting stopped, 3 of the gang were dead, including Charlie Dalton himself. Pete Dalton and 2 others were wounded but captured." "And Mr. Morrison?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Wounded but alive. He's laid up in the doc's office in Bent's Fork about 50 miles west of here. He sent me to find you and tell you he recovered most of your belongings. The gang had been using an old abandoned mine as their hideout, and they'd stored everything they'd stolen there." Sarah sank into her chair, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and gratitude. Jake Morrison had kept his promise. He had found the men who killed Thomas and recovered their stolen possessions. Most importantly, he had survived. "The deputy marshal in Bent's Fork is holding your property until you can claim it," Collins continued. "Morrison said to tell you that your silver locket and your husband's pocket watch were both there, along with most of the money." Emma clapped her hands together with delight. "He found Papa's watch and Mama's locket." The recovery of these precious items wouldn't bring Thomas back or erase the trauma they had endured, but it felt like a small victory against the forces that had tried to destroy them. More than that, it proved that sometimes justice did prevail, even on the lawless frontier. "There's more," Deputy Collins added. "The territorial governor has posted a reward for the capture of the Dalton gang. Morrison's entitled to most of it, but he's insisting that the victims share in the money. Comes to about $40 for your family, Mrs. Badrich, Mitchell." $40 was a significant sum, enough to provide real security for several months. Combined with the job offer from the Fletchers and the recovery of their possessions, it meant that Sarah and Emma could truly begin to rebuild their lives. That evening, as they sat around the fireplace after supper, Emma asked the question that had been on Sarah's mind all day. "Mama, are we going to go see Mr. Morrison? To thank him and get Papa's watch?" Sarah had been wondering the same thing. Bent's Fork was 3 days' journey from the trading post, and Jake Morrison might not even be conscious yet, but he had risked his life for them, had kept his promise against considerable odds. The least she could do was express her gratitude in person. "Yes, sweetheart," she decided. "We'll go see Mr. Morrison, and then we'll come back here and start our new life." Samuel offered to accompany them on the journey, but Sarah politely declined. This was something she needed to do herself. Jake Morrison had found her when she was at her lowest point and had offered hope when she had none. Seeing him recover from his wounds would help her believe that healing was possible, that life could indeed begin again after terrible loss. The next morning, as Sarah prepared for the journey to Bent's Fork, she realized that she was no longer the same broken woman who had wept beside a burned wagon 3 weeks ago. She was still grieving, would always grieve for Thomas and the life they had planned together, but she was also something she hadn't been since that terrible night. She was hopeful. Emma helped pack their few belongings with the excitement of a child embarking on an adventure. "Do you think Mr. Morrison will be glad to see us, Mama?" "I think he will, sweetheart. I think he'll be very glad indeed." As they prepared to leave Fletcher's trading post, Sarah took one last look around the place that had become their sanctuary. She knew they would return, would make their home here among these kind people who had taken in strangers without question. But first there was a debt of gratitude to be paid, and a chapter to be properly closed. Jake Morrison had appeared when all seemed lost, and had given them back not just their possessions, but their faith in justice and human kindness. Now it was time to complete the circle, to offer comfort to the man who had comforted them in their darkest hour. The town of Bent's Fork was smaller than Sarah had expected, consisting of little more than a main street lined with wooden buildings that looked as though they had been thrown together quickly to serve the needs of travelers and local ranchers. The doctor's office was easy to find, a 2-story building with a neat wooden sign that read, "Dr. Cecia, Marcus Webb, Physician and Surgeon," in carefully painted letters. Sarah and Emma had traveled for 3 days to reach this place, riding in Samuel Fletcher's sturdy wagon, with Margaret along to help with Emma and provide companionship for the journey. Now, as they stood before the doctor's door, Sarah felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. What would she say to Jake Morrison? How do you properly thank someone who has risked his life to seek justice for your family? The simple words, "thank you," seemed inadequate for what he had done. Webb proved to be a middle-aged man with prematurely gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering. When Sarah introduced herself, his weathered face immediately brightened with recognition. "Mrs. Mitchell, Morrison's been asking about you every day since he regained consciousness. He'll be mighty pleased to know you've come." The doctor's expression grew more serious. "I should warn you, though, he took a bullet in the shoulder and another grazed his ribs. He's healing well, but he's still weak from loss of blood." "Is he going to be all right?" Emma asked with the direct concern of a child. "Doctor." Webb smiled at her. "Yes, little miss. He's going to be just fine. Tough as rawhide, that one. Come on, I'll take you up to see him." Jake Morrison was propped up in a narrow bed in a small room on the 2nd floor, his left shoulder bound in clean white bandages. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes brightened immediately when Sarah and Emma entered the room. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, attempting to sit up straighter. "Emma, I was hoping you'd come." Sarah was surprised by the rush of emotion she felt at seeing him alive and conscious. This man had become so important to their survival, and the sight of him wounded because of his efforts on their behalf filled her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice not quite steady, "how are you feeling?" "Like I'd been shot twice and dragged behind a horse for 20 miles, he replied with a weak smile. "But Doc Webb says I'll live to fight another day." Emma approached the bed with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Did you really kill 3 bad men, Mr. Morrison?" "Emma!" Sarah scolded, but Jake held up his good hand to indicate it was all right. "I did what had to be done, little miss. Those men hurt a lot of innocent people, and they weren't going to stop on their own." "Did you get Papa's watch back?" Emma asked hopefully. Jake's expression softened. "I surely did. Your Papa's watch, your Mama's locket, and most of your family's money. Deputy Marshal Henderson has it all locked up safe in his office downstairs." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but these were tears of gratitude rather than grief. "Mr. Morrison, I don't know how to thank you. What you've done for us." "No need for thanks," Jake interrupted gently. "I had my own reasons for going after the Daltons. Helping you folks was just a blessed side benefit." But Sarah shook her head. "You could have ridden past our camp that evening. You could have left us to manage on our own. Instead, you took responsibility for 2 strangers and risked your life to see justice done." Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the small window. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of old sorrow. "When I found my brother and his wife, they'd been dead for 2 days. Their children were hiding in the root cellar, half dead from thirst and terror. Those little ones had listened to their parents being murdered and had been too afraid to come out, even to get water." He paused, his jaw tightening. I swore on their graves that the Daltons would pay for what they'd done. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being just about revenge and started being about making sure it didn't happen to other families. Sarah understood then that Jake Morrison's crusade against the Dalton gang had been as much about healing his own wounded soul as it had been about seeking justice for others. He had transformed his grief into purpose, his anger into protection for the innocent. "What will you do now?" she asked. Jake shrugged, then winced as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "Doc says I'll be laid up for another couple weeks. After that, I'm not sure. Heard there's trouble down in the Texas Panhandle, cattle rustlers hitting the big ranches. Might head that way." The casual way he spoke about moving on to another dangerous situation made Sarah realize something that surprised her. She didn't want Jake Morrison to ride away again. Over the past few weeks, she had come to think of him as more than just the rescuer. He was a good man, a decent man, who had shown kindness to her and Emma when they needed it most. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "have you ever considered settling down? Finding a place to call home?" Jake's expression grew thoughtful. "Can't say as I have, ma'am. I've been moving around for so long, I'm not sure I'd know how to stay in one place." "The Fletchers offered me a job at their trading post," Sarah said, not quite sure why she was sharing this information. "They said I could work there, help with the business, and they'd provide room and board for Emma and me." "That sounds like a fine opportunity," Jake replied. "Samuel and Margaret Fletcher are good people. You and Emma would be safe there." "Safe, yes," Sarah agreed. "But I keep thinking that a trading post would benefit from having someone around who knows how to handle trouble. Someone with your skills and experience." Jake stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush. Was she being too forward, too presumptuous? But something in his eyes suggested that her words had struck a chord. "Mrs. Buell's book." "Mitchell," he said slowly, "are you offering me a job?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time you stopped chasing outlaws across the territory and started building something instead of just tearing things down. The Fletchers could use a man like you, and Emma—" She paused, looking at her daughter, who was listening to every word with bright, hopeful eyes. "Emma could use a good man in her life, someone to teach her how to be strong and brave." Emma nodded eagerly. "You could teach me to ride a horse properly, Mr. Morrison, and how to shoot a rifle, and you could tell me stories about your adventures." Jake looked from Sarah to Emma and back again, his expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath, wondering if she had overstepped, if she had misinterpreted the connection she thought she felt between them. "It's been a long time since anyone needed me to stick around," Jake said finally. "I'm not sure I'd be much good at staying in one place." "You don't have to decide right now," Sarah said quickly. "Just think about it. The offer will be there when you're ready to make a decision." Dr. Webb appeared in the doorway, clearing his throat politely. "Sorry to interrupt, but Marshal Henderson would like to speak with Mrs. Mitchell about the recovered property." Deputy Marshal Henderson proved to be an efficient man who had all of the Mitchell family's recovered possessions carefully cataloged and ready for return. Sarah felt a surge of emotion as she held Thomas's pocket watch for the first time since the attack. The familiar weight of it in her palm brought back a flood of memories. Thomas checking the time before they broke camp each morning, winding it carefully each evening before they went to sleep. The silver locket had been her mother's, and before that, her grandmother's. Seeing it again was like being reunited with a piece of her family's history that she had thought lost forever. Emma gasped with delight when she saw her few rescued toys, apparently none the worse for their time in the outlaws' possession. But perhaps most importantly, the family's savings were intact. $63 was more money than many frontier families saw in a year, and it would provide a solid foundation for their new life at Fletcher's trading post. "Morrison insisted that you get the reward money too," Marshal Henderson added, handing Sarah an envelope containing $40 additional. "Said it rightfully belonged to the victims, not to him." The generosity of the gesture moved Sarah deeply. Jake Morrison had risked his life to recover their possessions and had then refused to take the monetary reward that was rightfully his. It was another example of the fundamental decency that seemed to guide all his actions. That evening, at the hotel where they had taken rooms for the night, Sarah sat with Emma as her daughter played with her recovered toys. The little girl seemed genuinely happy for the first time since the attack, chattering excitedly about seeing Mr. Morrison again and about their upcoming return to the trading post. "Mama," Emma said as Sarah tucked her into bed, "do you think Mr. Morrison will come back to the trading post with us?" "I don't know, sweetheart. That's his decision to make." "I hope he does," Emma said sleepily. "I like him. He makes me feel safe." Sarah understood exactly what her daughter meant. Jake Morrison's presence had that effect. His quiet strength and unshakable integrity created a sense of security that Sarah hadn't felt since Thomas's death. But more than that, there was something about Jake himself that appealed to her. He was a man of honor in a world where honor was often in short supply. The next morning, Sarah visited Jake's room one last time before beginning the journey back to the trading post. He looked stronger today, more color in his face, and more alertness in his eyes. "We'll be leaving this morning," she told him. "Back to Fletcher's trading post." "Safe travels," Jake replied. "And Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah, thank you for coming to see me. It means more than you know." Sarah hesitated at the door, wanting to say something more but not sure what it should be. Finally, she simply said, "You know where to find us, if you ever want to." Jake nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." The journey back to the trading post passed quickly, with Emma chattering constantly about their adventure and speculating about when Mr. Morrison might come to visit them. Sarah found herself thinking about Jake Morrison more than she probably should have. It felt somehow disloyal to Thomas's memory to be contemplating the possibility of another man in their lives, but she couldn't deny that Jake had awakened something in her that she had thought died with her husband. Samuel and Margaret welcomed them back to the trading post with genuine joy, exclaiming over Emma's recovered toys and admiring Thomas's watch and Sarah's locket. When Sarah formally accepted their job offer, Margaret hugged her with tears in her eyes. "You're family now," she declared. "You and Emma both." Life at the trading post settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah proved adept at managing inventory and dealing with customers, while Emma thrived under the continued attention of the Fletchers and the freedom to explore their new home. The wound of Thomas's death was still there, would always be there, but it was beginning to scar over in a way that suggested healing was possible. 2 weeks after their return from Bent's Fork, Sarah was working in the store when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Through the window, she saw a familiar figure on horseback, Jake Morrison, sitting tall in his saddle despite his recent injuries. Emma, who had been helping Margaret in the kitchen, came running at the sound of an arriving customer. When she saw who it was, her face lit up like sunshine. "Mr. Morrison, you came. You really came." Jake dismounted with careful movements that betrayed his still healing wounds, but he was smiling as Emma threw her arms around his waist in an enthusiastic hug. "Hello, little miss. I hope you don't mind an old saddle tramp showing up at your new home." Sarah emerged from the trading post, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. Jake looked good despite his recent ordeal. Still pale, but stronger than when she had last seen him. "Mr. Morrison?" she said, hoping her voice sounded more composed than she felt. "What brings you to our part of the territory?" Jake's expression grew serious. "Well, ma'am, I've been doing some thinking about what you said back in Bent's Fork, about settling down, finding a place to call home." He paused, looking around at the trading post and the surrounding prairie. "This seems like a fine place to make a stand." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Are you saying you'd like to take us up on our offer?" "If it's still open," Jake replied. "I figure I'm getting too old to keep chasing outlaws across 3 territories. Might be time to try my hand at building something instead of tearing things down." Emma clapped her hands together with delight. "Yes. Oh, yes. You can stay in the room next to ours, and I'll show you where the best fishing spots are, and you can teach me to shoot." Margaret and Samuel emerged from the trading post, having heard the commotion. When Sarah quickly explained Jake's decision, they both broke into broad grins. "Welcome to the family, Jake," Samuel said, extending his hand. "We can use a man of your skills around here." That evening, as they all sat around the dinner table sharing a meal and planning Jake's integration into the trading post's operations, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt like she was home. Jake caught her eye across the table as Emma regaled him with stories of her adventures with the barn cats. He smiled, and in that smile, Sarah saw the promise of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. It wouldn't be the life she and Thomas had planned, but it would be a good life nonetheless, built on friendship, mutual respect, and the kind of quiet love that grows slowly between people who have weathered storms together. Later, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter whispered excitedly, "Mama, I think Mr. Morrison is going to stay with us forever." "I hope so, sweetheart," Sarah replied, meaning it more than she had expected to. "I really hope so." Outside, she could hear Jake's voice mingling with Samuel's as they discussed plans for expanding the trading post's security and improving its defenses. The sound was reassuring, the voice of a protector who had chosen to stay rather than ride on to the next fight. Sarah stood at the window for a long time that night, looking out at the prairie stars and thinking about the strange turns life could take. 6 weeks ago, she had been weeping beside a burned wagon, certain that her story was ending in tragedy. Now she was embarking on a new chapter, one filled with unexpected possibilities and the promise of happiness she had thought lost forever. Jake Morrison had appeared when all seemed lost and had said the words she most needed to hear. "I'm here. Now he was here to stay, and Sarah Mitchell, no longer quite so lost, no longer quite so alone, was ready to begin again.